Hey, Britlick students, virtual students, we are beginning Romanticism. So this PowerPoint is all over Romanticism, and I will put this on uh, Google Classroom because I don't know how clearly you can see it. But anyway, all right. So British Romanticism starts roughly around 1798. Now, I would take a little bit, none of these genres or these time periods are ever absolute. So, Wollstonecraft, who was a romantic, she's at the very beginning. See, she wrote her treatise in 1792, so that would have been about 6 years before what this is saying is actually the beginning of Romanticism. So I would say roughly around 1790 or so really was when you start having this, going from the age of reason and enlightenment and starting to then a little turning away from all of these political tracks. Not that people weren't still writing them and reading them, it's not that, but people were getting tired of all of this, talk of politics and impending wars and, takeovers of monarchy and this sort of thing. And they were tired of it. And so they wanted to get away. They started having an interest in reading things that didn't have to necessarily do with what was going on in the world. So politics and the changing of monarchies or overthrowing of monarchies and this sort of revolutions and this sort of thing. Also keep in mind, this would have been then about 20 years or so, 25 years in that area, time period after the American Revolution. Now, yes, we're talking about the Brits, but the American Revolution had a huge impact on them, as you can imagine. All right, so the colonies then were on their own, so it was had influenced a lot that had impacted the Brits as well in a lot of ways. And then the British Romanticism, that's probably pretty close, 1832. American Romanticism was still going on during this time period because Poe wrote most of his work around in the 1840s, late 1830s, early 1840s. So American Romanticism trailed British Romanticism. American Romanticism ended roughly a little bit before the Civil War. Okay, so what does it mean to call something romantic when you're talking about this genre of romanticism? So it doesn't mean romantic love at all. So it's not Shakespearean sonnets or even love poetry. Not to say there's not some, because the British romantic poets, they did certainly write some love poetry, but that was not the real focus of Romanticism. Okay, some ideology, romantic ideology. The answers to life's most puzzling questions can be found through discussions with a simple person who lives in the country close to nature. You're going to hear the word nature throughout Romanticism, whether we're talking about the Brits or the Americans. Nature, nature, nature. So you're taking the test over Romanticism, and you don't know the answer. If one of the choices is nature, then you're going to probably be pretty close to being right if you choose nature. It's all about nature. Yeah, choose nature. When in doubt, choose nature. That's right. It's very different and the opposite of sophistication. And that doesn't mean that the Romantics weren't intelligent, because they were very intelligent. That doesn't mean that at all. But and we're going to see that especially when we read Wordsworth, who was, not that he wasn't some measure of sophistication, I don't mean that, but he certainly believed that his poetry, or that anybody's poetry, should be able to be read and understood and enjoyed by anyone, no matter what their level of education, sophistication, where they found themselves on the socioeconomic ladder, or, they could be the poorest of peasants, and they should be able to understand his poetry, which is why it's, in a lot of ways, it's very childlike when you start reading it. The answer to life's most puzzling questions can be found through a connection with nature. The use of one's imagination is more important than rationale, which would be based on reason or fact. So, completely opposite from Age of Reason and the Enlightenment period. So the Enlightenment would be, of course, Benjamin Franklin was an American, of course, but still, he was old, very much he, Jefferson, all the founding fathers, actually, Thomas Paine, they were all part, Rousseau, of the thinkers, the philosophers. It was all about rationale and reason. So then we come to a complete turning away from that with the Romantics. So it was no longer about head, it was all about heart. So emotions, heart, intuitiveness. Subjectivity, so personally biased, is more important than objectivity, or to be unbiased. So that makes total sense if you think about it. The scientists performing a scientific experiment, they're going to be totally unbiased. So it's all about what's the cause, what's the result. They don't have a dog in the fight. Okay? But the Romantics, completely opposite. So again, it's all based on their personal feelings about something. So they were much more biased, I guess you could say. Have any of y'all read much Poe? I know we read Telltale Heart last year in 1302. I think, did you read Telltale Heart in 1302?
I've read it some point.
Okay.
I know I've read like
Yes, okay. So the Telltale Heart was a short story about Poe where the man, he goes mad and he kills his companion, well, the landlord, I guess, and buries him under the floors in the house. I don't know. They may not have read it. Sometimes I do it in 1302 for like the
I read
characterization.
about the one.
I might have read it in Miss Callian's one.
Yeah, that's possible.
I know somebody did it for
Oh, okay. Also, Mask of the Red Death, that used to be in the English 1 textbook. I think Miss Callahan used to cover that, but I don't know.
I think we read
So,
one about the forest with the person who can kill like a family or something. Oh, that was a different.
Red Run.
Are you thinking of the one where it's with the grandmother? Yeah. That's a different.
Is that not Red Riding Hood?
It could be. You're thinking about in 1302, a big man's hard to find.
Yeah.
Yes. No, that's, yeah. Okay, I was just wondering. I remember we did that last year or not in 1302. All right, knowledge is gained through gut reactions and subjective hunches that's rather than level-headed, objective, rational thoughts. So it's all about that gut feeling and, again, emotions and intuitiveness and not thinking things through or rationalizing things. Nature is more important than highbrow art. I love that. So, to a romantic, nature would be much more beautiful than to go and look at some sophisticated art. So, yes to nature, no to Rembrandt, I guess, or something. Experimental trial and error is a better process than the conventional scientific method. Poetry should be spontaneous and full of emotion, not planned and straightforward. That is Wordsworth, Wordsworth, Wordsworth. In fact, he said that when someone reads poetry, they should have a spontaneous overflow of emotion. We'll be talking about that. It was one of his favorite things to say or quotes by Wordsworth. So to read poetry should make you have a gut reaction and a lot of emotion. Since hopefully y'all read Frankenstein, if you think about it, that is very much, and that's very much a theme of Frankenstein is being careful of science. Because look what happens. Look what happens when you embrace science. Now that's not to say that they didn't think that, there should be movement towards, to some extent, scientific endeavors and exploration and all, but they weren't saying no, 100% no to that, but just to be careful and not over-embrace science.
Yeah, Victor, I talked about how, there were these basically good scientists, but then Victor read all of, the stuff that wasn't really considered science.
Yes, that's exactly right. Well, that's a major, major thing in, that's a major theme of Frankenstein is not to be too overzealous when it comes to science. Sensitivity, feelings, and spontaneity are more important than intellectualism. Again, Frankenstein is a perfect example of that. Because if you think about it, the monster, the beast, or whatever you want, the creation, had feelings, didn't he? And so that was completely opposite from the fact that he was man-made and through science and how terribly wrong the science fell off and didn't come out like it was supposed to. Dare to be is a better motto than dare to know. Okay, a little bit more about Romanticism. The words romantic or romance originally referred to medieval tales of knights written in the original Roman language of Latin. These tales often included love stories between a knight and his lady, resulting in the modern meaning of romance. That sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? So think the Arthurian romances, courtly love. So that's where the word romantic and then romance come from. However, with what we're talking about when we're talking about the Romantic era or Romanticism in literature, what that actually is referring to is a freely imaginative fiction and not romantic. Romantic is in romantic love. So again, going back to Frankenstein, imaginative fiction, because that's not something that would really, really happen. Back to Poe, a lot of Poe, that's not something that's going to really, really happen. When we get to American literature next semester, Washington Irving, that's definitely not something that's going to really, really happen. If you've ever read, oh my goodness, well, Sleepy Hollow or Rip Van Winkle, fantasy, that's not going to happen. So very much a lot of imagination with that. We'll see that also. We're going to be reading Nathaniel Hawthorne. So some of his, not all, but some of his, the same thing. When you read Young Goodman Brown, did you read Young Goodman Young Goodman Brown, 1302? I don't think we do. So we'll be reading that, and certainly very much imaginative fiction. Okay, so let's look back, take a little step back and go think about Age of Reason, so Jonathan Swift and the satire and this sort of thing. Kind of funny, I don't know if y'all can see that, but that would be Swift, supposedly saying, or thinking, not saying, but thinking, if only I had some baby back ribs to, that would be off, some satire there, right? Jonathan Swift contemplates what will become the literary classic, A Modest Proposal. So, yeah.
No, either.
The Romantics did not, they did not write any satire, but kind of left with, became less popular once the Age of Reason started, the interest in that started trickling. Okay, some differences between Age of Reason and Romanticism. Okay, so in the Age of Reason, writers stressed reason and judgment, concern with the universal experience, the value of society as a whole, the value of rules. So that all makes a lot of sense if you think about it. A lot of people feel that the beginning of European, let's just broaden it and say European Romanticism began with the French Revolution. And so if you think about it, what were the French, what was happening and what was it that they were railing against? Well, the monarchy, rules, the church. They felt the church had way too much say in their lives. Way too much power given to the monarchy and this sort of thing. So it was absolutely a break away from rules. Not to say that they weren't saying there shouldn't be some, but they felt that because it all went to individuality. And before that, it was not so much the individual, it was more about society as a whole, and everything was for the goodness of society. So the French Revolution, that's exactly what was going on. People were turning away from that. So then here comes the Romanticism, the Romantic writers, who stressed imagination, emotion, concern with the particular experience. This is a biggie, the value of the individual human being. So again, individualism, being accepted for who you were. It wasn't so much that you just were expected to kind of go with the flow and the ideas of the time. Also, if you think about it, you see, remember, it had not been that long at this point that you had all the Puritans, right? So you had the colonization, you had the Puritans, and they were very much stressed community and the church community. There was very little to no individuality when you think about it, or individualism. If you think about it, they all dressed the same. Think about the Puritans. The women didn't, they all wore the same dresses, the same colors. You wore black, you wore white. You didn't wear anything that was colored. You wore a bonnet. Their homes were very plain. Their churches were extremely plain. Yeah, Amish. That's right. It's very much like the Amish, if you know anything much about them. So it's all about the society in the group. It's not individualism. So with the Romantics, you now have value as an individual person. So you can have your own thoughts, it's fine. You can have your own ideas, you can have your own opinions, the value of freedom. Again, it makes a lot of sense. Before you had this turning towards Romanticism, people didn't have a lot of freedom. You know, somebody was governing them. And I mean, like, not just like a government like we know in our society. I'm talking about a monarchy who told you what to do, how to worship, how you were going to be educated or that you weren't going to be educated if you were a woman, which is what Mary Wollstonecraft talked about and dealt with. So they very much, with the Romantics, valued freedom because a lot of them had had a taste of what, you know, it was like to not have freedom. So a lot of their work, of course, is very reflective of their appreciating and valuing their freedom. Oh, I didn't talk about all these things. So imagine, yeah, I did. Imagination, emotion. A little bit more. There is a lot. There are a lot of characteristics of Romanticism. Common man in childhood over urban sophistication. And as we read the Romantics, you're going to be seeing this. And you're going to see this idea, especially with Wordsworth, the poet. So again, his writing is very, in a lot of ways, very childlike. You know, you could read this to a young child, and they would probably pretty much get the gist of his poetry and what he was talking about. Now, I will say the other poets we're going to be reading, the Brit poets, so Shelley, Burns, if we get to him, Blake. We probably are not going to get to Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote the Ancient Mariner, but we might talk about it a little bit, but probably maybe an excerpt. But anyway, they were what I would call very highbrow. They did choose to use words and language that the more sophisticated might tend to understand more so than the common man, I would say. They didn't really hold the same ideas as Wordsworth. But other than that, you know, it was very much the common man over the sophisticates, the monarchy, turning away from sophistication. The Romantics believed in the natural goodness of humans, which is hindered by the urban life of civilization. So all about yay country setting, boo his inner city. Right? They believed that the savage is noble. You had a lot of when they talk about the savage, what they mean by that, not necessarily Native Americans and, you know, this sort of thing. Savage ideas mean like kind of going back to nature, living off the land, this sort of thing. Now, I will say, when we get into American Romanticism, we may not have time to read him, but it'll come to me in just a minute. He wrote Last of the Mohicans, which was made into a movie with three names. I'm just going blank. I'll have to look it up in a minute. But anyway, that's what he wrote about, was the captive narrative, more or less. So that became quite popular in the first, especially the first part of Romanticism, because that is one of the things that was often being dealt with. You had a lot of people, expansionism to some extent, and people moving out to, or maybe moving from the larger cities out in, or urban areas out into, you know, thinking they were going to farm the land and back to nature, that whole thing. And that was always one of the things that they, one of the dangers of doing that were the Native Americans and being taken captive. And so, anyway, there was a popular, that became very, very popular, which is kind of got into the savage is noble to some extent. Childhood is good, and the emotions inspired by both beliefs causes the heart to soar. It goes back to Wordsworth. Emotions over reason. Romantics believe that knowledge is gained through intuition rather than deduction. So again, all about your that gut feeling that you get, rather than pondering things and deducing some, answer. This is best summed up by Wordsworth, who stated that all good poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings or emotions. So that's, he thought, if a reader didn't feel some kind of, swelling of emotion when they read a poem, then that was a bad poet that wrote that in a bad poem. Nature over artificial, there we are back to nature. The Romantics stressed the awe of nature in art, in language, and the experience of sublimity or the sublime. Through a connection with nature, Romantics rejected the ideas of the Industrial Revolution and were very anti-industrial revolution. In fact, when they started laying the railroads, this would be during American Romanticism, that was kind of the beginning of the end to some extent for Romanticism, but that just killed the Romantics. They hated that. Because think about it, they interrupted nature to be laying railroad tracks, which is all about expansionism and industrialization and people, the urban areas growing. So that they did not like that. It broke their hearts. The individual over society. Romantics often elevated the achievements of the misunderstood, heroic individual outcast. And you see that in some of the work that we're going to be reading, especially with the poets. So if you were misunderstood, Shelley, not Mary, her husband, really know what I'm talking about. If you were misunderstood and kind of almost like living on the fringes of society, then you were a hero to the Romantics. Right.
So like,
Yeah. Absolutely. Living on the edge of society. Yes. Imagination over logic, so Romantics legitimize the individual imagination as a critical authority. Has anybody ever seen Last of the Mohicans? That's a great movie. It's got Daniel Day-Lewis in it, about 25 years ago. It's really good. Yeah, James Fenimore Cooper. He was an American romantic. We usually don't get to him. Okay, so this painting, 1819. This is, we're going to look at some that really epitomize the ideas of the Romantics. So you notice nature, right? So you don't see, this is certainly out somewhere. There's not a smokestack in sight or, certainly far away from any kind of urbanization. There's another one. The Romantics, nature provided the pattern on which to base their creative lives. The Romantics watched the cities grew, industry prospered, and farming life declined. In an effort to reclaim nature, the Romantics made it a central force in their lives and their literature. Nature was celebrated as a source of delight, an image of love, and a model of moral perfection. When we read Washington Irving and we read Rip Van Winkle, you see very much, because he's considered to be sort of the father of American Romanticism. And so Rip Van Winkle is taking place, of course, Rip goes to sleep for 20 years, I believe, 20. And so when he goes to sleep, it's pre-revolution. When he wakes up, it's post-revolution. And that's what the story, basically, that's one of the themes. So, it's going from nature, there's this change. And it's more to urbanization. So things have changed. And, so anyway, that's a really good example of what this is talking about right here. Okay, so another painting. So again, Very, beautiful, beautiful, although you do see back here, I think this is probably supposed to be on, the Thames Lake or something, I don't know. Thames River, not lake. And so there would be, that looks like it might be kind of a little smokestack right there, so that's a lot of irony going on here, but the nature is at the forefront, but then you have the dreaded, evil urbanization, in the back. There's some major romantic era poets, so Wordsworth, he was really kind of the father, he's kind of considered to be the father, he was really the first, I guess, a British romantic poet, and then you have William Blake, Lord Byron, he was really an interesting fellow. Percy Shelley, so Mary's husband, John Keats, another great poet that we usually don't get to him. Robert Burns, he was a real interesting guy. He was not only Burns or Blake, I get Blake and Burns mixed up. Anyway, one of the two, he had a lot of mental illness, but he was besides being a great poet, he was also a painter. And you can actually buy his paintings they still have prints of his paintings on Amazon. I forget which one. Maybe it was Blake, forget. And then Samuel Taylor Coleridge, another great. He's actually, Mary Shelley was very influenced by him. Her father, he was a philosopher. We'll talk about him because he was Mary Wollstonecraft's husband. And he was a great philosopher and a writer himself, but he didn't write fiction. But anyway, he was in with a lot of the popular literary figures of the time and philosophers and all this, living in England and all. And so he was very good friends with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And so in Frankenstein, Mary Shelley actually quotes a part of Rime of the Ancient Mariner. She was very influenced as a little girl. Coleridge would come to her house and they would have like gatherings or parties or whatever, and he would read some of his poetry. And so Mary Shelley was as a little girl, was very influenced by Coleridge, which is why she quotes from his poem in Frankenstein. All right, we will leave it at that, and we'll talk a little bit more about, finish up with just a little bit on these poets that we're going to be talking about, and then we will do Mary Wollstonecraft tomorrow.
Any other bells?
Yeah, I think it did.
Yeah.
It was William Blake. Okay. Yeah, we're going to be talking about Blake, so here's some of his artwork. Kind of different a little bit, but there's still, people, you can still buy these prints. He's kind of an extremely talented guy, but he had mental illness, and he had a lot of problems. Very talented man. info on my. North Carolina, still counting ballots too. We vote to call.
Well, I saw stuff that said that Wisconsin or something had more people, more votes counted than people registered to vote.
Yeah.
Really? Ooh.
Mail-in votes, yeah.
Ooh, that's a big problem. 18 minutes ago, Biden would declare victory once the campaign believes they've reached 270 electoral votes. Trump said 13 minutes ago, Trump campaign says it will request Wisconsin recount. So there it goes, it's already started.
Yes, it should.
Well, I mean, I mean, whichever one, either one should certainly, declare a, or ask for a recount, with it being this close. I think that it should be, no matter who comes out on top.
It's gonna appreciate it. Thinking about it, let's say, or let's say, right.
Hey, y'all having a great day. So do you think you might still be interested in like doing writing or journalism? I could see you doing that too. They usually start right after the first year, but some things now because of COVID, usually we go to like 4 competitions in UIL. But generally we do like PNG, Hampshire Connect, Nederland, and sometimes we do, like last year, I took a group, not everybody went, but I took a group to, what is that area called? Bean Pass. They have a good one. But this year, I'm not quite sure. I was talking to Ms. Thibodeau, and there's just so much up in the air with COVID. And there's possibilities, some of it may have to be done like through Zoom and online thing, or something with things here at the school.
Yeah.
But I don't know, it's just kind of up in the air, but hopefully things will be back to normal. You'll be a senior next year, so if you're interested, you can kind of dip your toe in it this year, and usually by the second year, that's when people start really doing very well, and possibly winning some competitions, and they can be going on to area and state, and that sort of deal, so. I think you do real well at it.
Thank you. The only thing I can say is I probably can't because I don't have the time.
Yeah, well, I understand that, sure. No,
I'd have to know like the specific dates. I
yeah,
check with my parents,
sure, right.
but,
Well, as soon as I kind of get something, she didn't really have anything to give us much a couple of weeks ago. They had their meeting. Ms. Thibodeau does UIL for our school district, or for our high school, rather. And they had a UIL meeting, but it was just so many things with dates kind of up in the air. there because what I think was going on is like, a couple, I know, I think it was Nina and Hansel Connect, they weren't quite sure that they were going to even be able to have one because of this with COVID. So that's kind of normally by now, see, we have a list of the dates and the whole deal.
Yeah.
We're rocking and rolling, but it's a lot of it's kind of up in the air. But once we, I get some things kind of, nailed down a little bit more, I'll pass it on to you and just kind of see if those, like it work, you're still interested or anything like that.
Yeah, all right, thanks.
Okay, you're welcome. Bye.
Bye.